Hello, Andrew here again. Today we're on episode 175, and it's a difficult one to talk about in some ways, so I'm taking a couple of different approaches to it, which might seem quite disparate, but I hope you'll get something out of it. So we're continuing in our series in Matthew. We're in chapter 24. And today this is again about Jesus, talking about what he sees happening in the end of all things, how the age comes to a close. And so he picks the narrative, we pick up the narrative of chapter 24 verse 15. And hear the words of Jesus. So when you see the desolating sacrilege standing in the holy place, as was spoken of by the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand, then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. The one on the rooftop must not go down to take what's in the house. The one in the field must not turn back to get a coat. Woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath, for at that time there will be great suffering, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. And if those days had not been cut short, no one would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. So we see here that Jesus references the prophecies of Daniel. Daniel is a really interesting book. It's probably over 30 years since I spent any real time, and I spent quite a bit of time in that. And it's interesting to watch the way and look at the way that it dovetails with the book of Revelation. There's some interesting ways that it can be approached. Anyway, that's what he references. And again, as I said in the last couple of episodes, that this is specific to Israel, to events in the Holy Land. In the end, it may leave us with more questions than answers, and we've got to keep thinking, we've got to keep remembering that that is the context. This isn't, I would suggest, not a general thing, although there are applications for us that we can take. But I want to suggest that its context is within the Holy Land, and Jesus was looking in the not too distant future for himself. Questions, in the end, it may leave us with more questions than answers, questions that I can't answer, but ones that might give us some pointers on broader issues of application to the complexities of life today. Interestingly, by the time of Jesus, these prophecies, the ones that we see in Daniel, particularly the ones that he references here about the desolation, what does he call it? This is the New Revised Standard Version, the desecrating sacrilege. That these prophecies had already been prefigured. There's a sense they had already been fulfilled, or at least partially fulfilled, during the reign of the Seleucid king Antiochus IV, Antiochus Epiphanes. The name he chose for himself says it all. It means God manifest. Who calls themselves that? He's implying that God in him has appeared in the flesh. It's interesting, isn't it? Because we know that God has appeared in the flesh, but it's certainly not in this character. His intent was to Hellenize the Jewish people. That is, he wanted to make Greeks out of them. He went to considerable efforts to stop religious observances of any kind, particularly Jewish ones. He went to quite extremes to do that. The sacrifices were stopped. He burnt scriptures and severely punished the owners, and a severe punishment often meant death. And apparently he set up an idol and an altar to Zeus, and he put it on top of the altar to Yahweh in the holy place within the temple. And he sacrificed pigs on it. He's doing everything he could to be as offensive as possible. This was the desolating sacrilege. Now this was the match that set fire to a tinder-dry situation waiting to explode. There was a revolt led by the Maccabees. Many thousands died. this huge suffering. And here Jesus tells the people that all this is yet ahead of them. Now, it's in the past, at the time of Jesus, but he's also telling them, yet it's also ahead. Sometimes prophecies have a way of repeating themselves and gathering momentum. A smaller one, a bigger one, and we'll see what happens next. And apparently this is to be repeated at some time. And it will be worse. Much, much worse. Jerusalem and the temple, which was in front of Jesus, was destroyed in AD 70, another 40 years or so, less than 40 years ahead. But this was not it. This was not what Jesus was talking about. It's worse. That's one of the reasons that some believe that the Jerusalem temple has to be rebuilt before the end can come, partly so that this prophecy can be fulfilled in its fullness. If there's no temple, if there's no place of worship, if there's no place for the sacrifices, how can this kind of prophecy happen? So that's the question that some would raise. I'm not too sure if that would be necessary, because there's a great deal of, it seems to me, of symbolism involved. It's been nearly 2,000 years since the sacrificial system of the temple has been in place, and Judaism has both survived and often thrived since then. Without it, the practice of the sacrificial temple cult does not appear to be essential for the heart of Judaism to prosper. In so many ways, it would seem like a backward step. Certainly from a Christian perspective, it would be a backward step into barbaric and primitive times. Here we are, we're the ones that look at Jesus as the one who has done all that's required, in that one perfect giving of himself. He takes all our sin upon himself. No more of that is required. That's a Christian perspective. See, the advent, the life, the death, the resurrection and elevation to glory of Jesus has put to an end the need for all of the sacrifices of animals in order to, how do we put it, to deal with the issue of sin. Perhaps then, it's events that will mark the change. It reminds me, you hear what I'm saying here, there's something happens that marks that something big is going to follow, that something significant is at play, and we need to be taking notice. It reminds me of the words of Zechariah 4 and 10. There's an exhortation not to despise the day of small beginnings. In its context, the small beginnings was the sight of Zerubbabel with a plumb bob in his hand, ready to start on the rebuilding of the temple after the Babylonian captivity. Now, this is a very small beginning, but it shows intent. It shows a commitment to rebuilding. And Zechariah says, we're not to despise. The Lord says not to despise the day of small beginnings. It's a small beginning, but this is the beginning of something that is going to be quite important. So this was a portent of things to come, the re-establishment of the sacrificial temple worship in Israel. So we see the small beginning here in Jesus warning the people about the desolating sacrilege standing in the holy place. In itself, it may seem like a small thing, yet it is the herald of much worse to follow. They've already had an example of it. They saw it, as I said, in the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. They saw a picture of what supposedly little event could cause, where he actually pokes the bear and gets a very adverse reaction, and the consequences are pretty awful for everybody. Let me see where I am here. It's worth noting, in our own world, in our own time, in our own day, the events happening in our own lives. Interestingly, it depends on our perspective on how we will see these events. I think that's really quite interesting. Whether you see an event as the beginning of something positive or the beginning of something negative. Many on the right of our politics will have seen the stepping aside of Andrew Little as the leader of the Labour Party. This was back at the last election, 2017. to allow Jacinda Ardern to become its leader as a portent of disaster, because she ultimately became the Prime Minister. Yet for others, her becoming the Prime Minister and the way in which it happened, I have huge respect for Andrew Little in what he did. It was an act of courage and humility and of pure grace that he steps aside. And as a result of that, when I think about the things that have happened in the last few years, I was trying to think, there's something probably before this, but last year we had the mosque shootings in Christchurch. And I think she just has led the nation superbly in terms of how she responded to that. And she's given us a masterclass in leadership in dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. I don't doubt that at all. The difficulty is it depends on where you're standing on how you're seeing. There'll be some people that would have thought that other things should be done and that another leader, another government would have handled it even better. I'm kind of doubtful. You look around the planet and think, actually, it's arguable that we're in the best position of just about any nation on the earth. And that's a leadership issue. It's a leadership issue. But it started with one man realizing that he was on the path to a hiding, and rather than doubling down and letting his ego get in the way, he was willing to step aside and say, actually, I think this is the person that we should have as our leader, because she, a woman, an unmarried woman living with a man, she is the one that can potentially lead us to a better place. And as we know, the rest is history. In the USA, the 2016 election of Donald Trump to the presidency has been seen by many as a great tragedy, and by others as a great cause for celebration. Christians line up on both sides, each equally convinced of the rightness of their cause and that God is actually in their corner. For both, it is a portent of things to come, a small beginning, but of what? Of a new era of prosperity, or of a new era of international uncertainty and instability. In many ways, it may be still too early to be sure which it's going to be. And while we may disagree about what they actually mean, I'm interested that we can all agree that these small beginnings are significant. They ultimately set the course and direction of nations. Already in the USA, as a result of the 2016 elections, the Supreme Court balance has almost certainly been skewed 6-3 in the favour of conservatives. And for those who follow American politics, you'll be aware of how significant, how important this is. It will affect the life of that nation for decades to come. And Christians are divided on this, not only on the outcome and what it is likely to mean long term, but also on what many perceive as the lack of integrity of the process that got them there. We discover, referencing an episode a couple back, that for many the ends do justify the means. I don't think that's the way of Jesus, but everything, as I say, is open for interpretation. But let's come back now to the text. What would need to happen in Israel for this prophecy to be fulfilled? What kind of portent would be required that drove a stake in the heart so that Israel's heritage, its history as the covenant people of Yahweh, was being so completely violated, undermined, and called into question? I don't know. The encouragement is to keep our eyes open, our antenna alert to not only what is happening, but to what it could mean. Watch the small things, but the things that are out of the ordinary. They're not just small, ordinary things. I think there are things that are kind of out of left field, small but out of the ordinary, and see what it's actually implying or where it's going. And what we see for Jesus is the only option is to flee as fast, as quickly as one can. There will be no time for making preparations. Go now. Go immediately. And this makes sense given modern technology, modern military technology, the speed at which it can be deployed, and the extent of its reach. The whole thought of even trying to outrun it could seem like an exercise in futility, a hopeless option. That says something about the size of the threat that will loom and the urgency to act. What will it be? I don't know. How bad will it be? Horrific. If the days had not been shortened, is what Jesus said, and I take this as a code for divine intervention, then none of God's people would survive. It'll be that bad. It's a cheery thought, eh? Not so much. This is one of the passages, as I said, I'd rather have passed over. It serves as a warning, though, that at some time in the future there will be some extraordinarily tough times ahead. The simple truth, however, is that we don't need to look far to see that at all times, at any time, there are extraordinarily tough times for somebody. It's just usually not us. It's true, isn't it? You just got to look at the world around you. Just watch the news and you'll see that somebody somewhere is going through an excruciatingly bad time. And what they need is our prayers, our support and our love. And who knows, one day it might be us needing exactly those same things. Well, God bless you.